Now, let's turn to the third macroeconomic objective of price stability. Economists are mostly concerned about the general changes in the price of goods and services in the economy. This is known as inflation. Also, they also need to know about the movement of prices so that they can make a difference between nominal and real values. For example, a consumer can purchase much less with 100 Rand today than in 1980 when prices were much lower. In other words, the real value or purchasing power of 100 Rand today is now much less than it was in 1980. To estimate the changes in the purchasing power of our currency, we need to investigate what is happening to the individual prices. This is best achieved by the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index (CPI) is an index of prices of a representative basket of consumer goods and services, hence it represents the cost of the shopping basket of goods and services of a typical or average household. Consumer Price Index is constructed by Statistics South Africa in South Africa. In its construction, Statistics South Africa does the following. Firstly, they select the goods and services to be included into the basket. Secondly, they assign weights to each goods and services to indicate its relative importance in the basket. Thirdly, they decide on a base year for calculating the Consumer Price Index. Fourthly, they decide on the formula for calculating Consumer Price Index. And lastly, they collect prices each month to calculate the value of Consumer Price Index for that specific month. The table 5.5 illustrates the South African Consumer Price Index for all urban areas for the period 2016 to 2017. The weights on the different groups of goods and services included are based on the 2014-2015 survey on household income and expenditure. These values are average values for the year. The last column indicates the percentage increases for each group and for the total basket between 2016-2017. Yeah. The last bottom value or figure of 5.3 is usually taken as the average South African inflation rate in 2017. Therefore, from the table one can see that the changes in food, transport and housing dominate the major movements in the overall CPI in South Africa. More so, we observe that food and non-alcoholic beverages contributed the highest percentage change in Consumer Price Index for the period 2016-2017. Now let's turn to the fourth macroeconomic objective of balance of payments stability. The balance of payments refers to a record of all transactions of a country with the rest of the world. The balance of payment is composed of two major accounts, namely the current account and the financial account. The current account keeps a record of all sales and purchases of goods and services with the rest of the world, as well as the primary income receipts and payments. Likewise, the financial account keeps records of all purely financial flows in and out of the country. If there is a surplus on the current account trade balance, it shows that the value of exports exceeds the value of imports for the period under review, and the reverse is true. If there is a surplus on the financial account, it shows that there had been more funds flowing into the country, thus a net inflow of funds during the period under review, whereas a deficit on the financial account reflects a net outflow of funds from the country over the period under review. It is possible to have both current account and financial account in a surplus or a deficit. However, if we add the two balances, we obtain the change in the country's gold and foreign reserves. See Table 5.6 in the prescribed macro textbook for the illustration of the South African balance of payments for 2017. Note that the sum of all international transactions shown in the current capital and financial account should add up to zero. In practice, this is not the case due to errors and omissions that happens during the compilation of the individual components of the balance of payments. Hence, an item called unrecorded transaction is used to ensure that the balance of payment account balances. More so, note that the balance of payment requires that the current account balance should be equal to net capital and financial account transactions plus net reserve asset transactions. This amount of reserve assets basically show the difference between the current and financial account. If reserve asset balance is negative, it shows that there had been an increase in reserve assets for the period under review. Now let's turn to the fifth macroeconomic objective of equitable distribution of income. There are three measures applied to measure the degree of equality amongst households in an economy. These are the Lorenz curve, the Gini coefficient, and the quantile ratio. These measures require reliable information about the income of each individual or household in the economy during a particular period. A Lorenz curve, named after an American statistician, Max O. Lorenz, is a simple graphical device that illustrates the degree of inequality in the distribution of income or any other variable. To construct the Lorenz curve, the different households in the economy should be ranked from the poorest to the richest. This is achieved on a cumulative percentage basis. Then the cumulative percentage of the population are plotted along the horizontal axis, whereas the vertical axis reflects the cumulative percentage of total income. The axes are then joined to form a square with a horizontal line running diagonally from the origin to the opposite upper corner of the rectangle, as shown in figure 5.1. The diagonal line indicates a perfectly equal distribution of income, where along the line income is distributed evenly amongst all households in the economy. Using a hypothetical example where the poorest 20% earn 3% of the income, the next 20% earns 7% of income, and the next 20% earn 5% of the income, whilst the next 20% earns 25%, and the last 20% earn 50% of the income. We can construct a curve as indicated by A, B, C, D in figure 5.1. The degree of inequality is reflected by the deviation of our curve from the diagonal line. The greater the distance from the diagonal line is, the constructed Lorenz curve, the greater the degree of inequality. Therefore, the shaded area is called the area of inequality, which is the area in between our constructed Lorenz curve and the horizontal line of equality. The second measure of inequality is called the Gini coefficient, invented by an Italian demographer, Corrado Gini. The Gini coefficient is obtained by dividing the area of inequality shown by the Lorenz curve by the area of the right angle triangle formed by the axis and the horizontal line of equality, thus triangle OAB. The Gini coefficient can vary between 0 and 1. However, if we multiply it by 100, we obtain a Gini index that varies between a 0 and 100. When incomes are distributed perfectly equal, the Gini coefficient will be 0, whereas when they are distributed perfectly unequal, the Gini coefficient will be equal to 1. In practice, the Gini coefficient usually ranges between 0.3 to 0.7, where 0.3 reflects a relatively high equal distribution, whereas a 0.7 coefficient represents a relatively high unequal distribution of income. The third measure of income inequality is the quantile ratio. The quantile ratio is the ratio between the percentage of income earned by the highest 10 or X percent of the population and the percentage of income earned by the lowest 10 or Y percent of the population. The higher the ratio, the greater the degree of inequality. The South African Gini coefficient in 2014 was reported to be 0.67, reflecting a very high level of income inequality. This high level of income inequality is accompanied by the high level of unemployment in South Africa. These two are probably the most serious social, political, and economic problems the South African economy faces. There are three most important credit rating agencies, namely Moody's Investor Services, Standard and Poor Global Ratings, and Fitch Ratings. Credit rating agencies apply a number of indicators and qualitative information to assess the economic performance and credit risk of a country. For South Africa, the ratings peaked in 2009 but subsequently declined sharply by late 2017. Both Standard Poor Global Rating and Fitch downgraded the foreign and local current debt to non-investment grade or junk status. This downgrading have various implications for economic growth and development of the country.